if you're not sure 100% in your heart that you want to play in an orchestra, you have to consider that you're not going to, because you won't play in an orchestra if you're not 100% dedicated. Because for every person like you who's not 100% there are 10 who are 100% there, and even they might not get the job. Hi, I'm Sean Perrin, and you're listening to episode 167 of the Clarineat podcast, the show for clarinetists. Today's episode of the show is part 4 of a series guest hosted by Joel Jaffe, and his guest today is actually me. I'm of course the host of the Clarineat podcast here and also another show called OK Podcast. I'm the online sales and marketing manager for Backun Musical Services and Laskey Mouthpieces, Clarinet Faculty at Mount Royal University in Calgary, and a performing and recording and teaching artist in the Calgary area. I discuss some of my passions outside of music, ranging from cars to cooking. I share some details about my life and the life-altering injury I had in 2016, which did change the course of my clarinet career, what it's like working with a major clarinet manufacturer day to day, having a family as a musician, and much, much more. So this is really fun to talk to Joel. It's always nice to have the mic turned around on me for a chance to share some of my stories on the podcast here. And I do want to give a huge shout out to Joel. I think he's done a great job on the previous few episodes here, interviewing Denise Gainey and Diane Barger and Jessica Phillips. And he's got some more episodes planned because this has been received pretty well. And I think he's doing a really great job. So thank you so much to Joel for stepping in and really helping out during this busy time for my family. We've got a really young, less than 3-month-old daughter here, and it's been definitely a challenge, and it's been nice to actually listen to the podcast a bit with fresh ears. I just think he's doing a great job. So thanks so much to Joel. Before we get started with today's episode, I do just want to add a quick note, and that is that at the end, Joel asked me some question, and my response was basically to say that I was thankful for world peace that we have and prosperity. And I don't want it to seem like I'm ignorant of world events. Obviously, I know the horrible situation that we are now finding ourselves in. But I also don't want to rescind my statement because I think that it makes sort of a point about how the state of the world is rather fragile. And I think really that my statement was true at the time this was recorded from my perspective anyway. So I don't want to seem like I'm being insensitive, so please take that for what it is. But obviously I do not condone what's happening right now, and in any sense, and never really condoning violence. That's always wrong in my opinion. But I really think that I don't want to appear insensitive to this situation. But so please understand that as you listen. But otherwise, I do hope that you enjoy today's episode. I want to also thank quickly our sponsors for making the show possible, and also those who support the show directly. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, you can do this at clarineat.com/join, and you can get a free trial of the Clarineat Gold Edition by using code TRYGOLD, that's TRYGOLD, at clarineat.com/join. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much again to Joel for hosting today's episode. The new Backun Q-Series clarinet features a completely redesigned bore inspired by the Backun Custom Series clarinets. This means you can play and perform like the pros, but for less. Use code Clarineat at backunmusical.com to save 10% on your entire purchase, and try the Backun Q-Series or Protégé clarinet risk-free for 30 days. Just pay the return shipping if you aren't fully satisfied. Shop now at backunmusical.com and use code Clarineat at checkout. Imagine a reed that lets you focus on your music, lasts for months instead of days, and even saves you money in the long run. It's all possible with Leger Reeds, the world's leading synthetic reed brand made right here in Canada. The European cut reed is preferred by Leger artists all over the world, including Eddie Daniels, David Schifrin, Corrado Giuffretti, and many others. It offers a warm, clean sound with a great ease of articulation and is now available for E-flat, B-flat, and the bass clarinet. Learn more at your local music store or at leger.com. That's LEGERE.com. So I'm here today on the podcast with Joel Jaffe, who's coming to me today from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Joel, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, you were on the podcast several years ago, and we did talk about a lot of really interesting things. And little did I know back then that I would someday start working for Backun and doing some of those sort of same interesting things. But do go check that out. He talked a lot about travel tips for musicians and what it's like working day to day at Backun. And but Joel, what have you been up to the last, I guess it's been 4 years, and how have things changed for you?
Well, certainly for me, things have changed most dramatically during COVID, where my travel schedule came to a screeching halt. Previous to that, I was on planes, trains, and automobiles almost let's say 200,000, 220,000 miles a year out of the country, about 200 days of the year, traveling internationally to represent Backun and grow our brand, and also onboard a new company that Backun acquired in 2019, the Laskey Mouthpiece Company. A lot of our listeners are instrumentalists, but clarinet players specifically. However, Backun branched out and acquired a brass mouthpiece company. This is something that we'd always wanted to do, and so I was very deeply involved in that acquisition and then the product development and the launch of it, of which, Sean, you've helped significantly with too. So that has been the main shift for me. I am spending a hell of a lot more time with my family, with my 3 kids, which is needed, and it was needed, and more time with my wife. And it's been really nice to just see them grow up the last few years. I mean, they've had their own struggles with COVID and obviously being homeschooled and all. But aside from a few months of slowdown for Backun in terms of our staff working remotely, I came back to an office that was pretty much the same before we left, with the exception of me now being in the office all the time and taking all of my Zoom meetings or meetings by Zoom. So for me, that's been the biggest change. Prior to COVID, it was just focusing on our product quality and product development, working on the bass clarinets, working on the Vocalese mouthpiece project, which we can talk about if you think that it's of value for the listeners in terms of how that project got started. It was basically a conversation between me and Richard Hawkins while I was on a layover in Denver. And that was quite an interesting conversation, and that sort of spun up the Vocalese project out of nowhere. As usual, I talk to a lot of artists, a lot of Backun artists, and a lot of artists that want to play Backun that are playing other brands. I'm always on the phone. I'm always on text. And Richard Hawkins and I have always been very close, and I was just chatting with him. And he had decided after Zinner made the announcement to close that he was going to close up his mouthpiece business. For a lot of people, they might know that Hawkins actually brought Zinner to North America many, many, many years ago. It was on a tour. He was in Germany, I believe it was with Eddie Daniels and several other artists and people, and he found Zinner in some music store. Zinner Mouthpieces reached out to them, started working with them, ended up bringing Zinner to North America, and he had a really good relationship with them, and he was hand refacing their mouthpieces based on his designs, the molds, and he built a huge following. I mean, he really is the Casper of his day. And Richard and I were talking about it, and he said, I'm going to hang it up. I'm going to shut it down. I'm going to stop making mouthpieces. I'm going to take a hiatus, and then we'll think about what to do. And I said, okay. And a couple months later, that was in June, that we sort of let everything rest. And I was on this layover in Denver. I remember it really, very, very specifically. I was eating a piece of pizza. I was chatting with Hawkins, sort of in between discussion points. And I said to him, what would it be like if we made a mouthpiece? What would it be like if we machined a mouthpiece from start to finish on one of our 9-axis CNC machines in a what's called done-in-one process? Now, a lot of other manufacturers make CNC milled mouthpieces. What they typically do is they load up the mouthpiece on one side and they machine part of it, and then they take it out and touch it up and then reload it on the machine and then machine the other side. And this was something totally different. We knew we had the technology to do it. And truth be told, we pretty much had done it. We were about 90% there, 95% maybe. But that last 5% is like 150%. There's just so much extra work to do. So Hawkins is like, well, if you're already kind of there, have Jeremy Backun is my cousin and Maury Backun's son. Jer runs the operations for Backun. He is the VP of Ops, and he is also the person responsible for engineering, manufacturing, CNC development, all of that kind of stuff. So I said to Jer, can you run up one of those mouthpieces you made a few years ago and kind of put to rest? And he was like, yeah, sure. So he ran it off and he sent it to Hawkins, and it was just quiet. And then Hawkins sent me a text. He's like, I think I can work with this. And that was the start of a very close relationship. Hawkins was up in Vancouver quite often, flying back and forth, working with Jeremy, fine-tuning the mouthpiece. And from that moment, I believe that was in August of 2018, to the launch, which was April of 2019, we finalized this mouthpiece and launched it to great success. I mean, we have sold tens of thousands of these mouthpieces. We've expanded to the bass clarinet, finalizing the E-flat mouthpiece right now. We've joked about doing a contra and even going to A-flat sopranino, and who knows what other models we're going to be making. But it's been an incredible experience, and during that time, I've also become really close with Richard. I chat with him pretty much every day. I would say I text multiple times with him or have a phone call, sometimes business related, but not always. And we decided in partnership to brand this the Vocalese mouthpiece by Hawkins and Backun. So it's not just a Backun product, but it's a Hawkins product because he is a great mouthpiece craftsperson. He really is. And not only that, I wish the listeners would have a chance to hear him play more. He is a virtuoso. If a lot of you don't know, I mean, he debuted, I believe, with the National Symphony with Rostropovich conducting when he was 19 years old. I mean, he is a prodigy of the clarinet, but he has made his decision and his career based on teaching because it's what he loves to do. And he teaches at Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio, and he's built an incredible life for himself.
Do you think that so much of what ended up coming out of this was the modern technology, which has, now been available to people and that Backun sort of had on hand that enabled this project? Or like, how would this have looked different before?
Well, Zinner really was one of the few main mouthpiece makers that was making what we call OEM, original equipment manufactured mouthpieces or parts, private label, for mouthpiece makers. So previous to Vocalese, we would order Zinner mouthpieces in certain sizes. They had different facings, different lengths, different bore sizes. So we would order them, and then we would customize them ourselves, and we would put the MOBA name on it. We did that for a number of years, and it was very successful. They were great mouthpieces. But what it allowed us to do, and other manufacturers, is to look outside the proverbial box and say, what else is there? And other manufacturers have come to the table in terms of CNC machining their mouthpieces. And this is nothing new for a lot of manufacturers. Look at the sax mouthpiece market. I mean, it is crazy how many sax mouthpiece makers there are, especially for metal mouthpieces and non-classical sax mouthpieces. So it's just something that we knew we could do, but knowing our technology, I mean, Maury has always been adamant at investing in technology, investing in people, investing in the skills to advance what we do. And as he likes to say, take that game to the next field, take it to a different field. So by working on the mouthpieces, the same way we attacked the development of our clarinets in just a completely different way. For those of you who have ever tried a Backun clarinet, it's not like your traditional clarinet. It's different, and there's a reason for it. So we did that with Vocalese, and we basically wiped the slate clean, and we said to Hawkins, what would it be like if you had your mouthpiece? Any mouthpiece you could design from stem to stern, what would it be like? And we didn't stop. We didn't roll it out until it was ready. And as you know, Sean, because you were involved in that, I mean, there were a lot of back and forth discussions. There were nomenclature discussions and how many models are we going to roll with. And Hawkins said, I only want to do 3. And initially there was only 3. So we called them R, G, and H for Richard Grant Hawkins. And then came the RGH2 or R2G2H2 to account for the 442 tuning. And then we onboarded the CG model for Corrado Giaffredi, who is a phenomenal artist and a very close friend of our families and has been very supportive of us over the years. And then finally, we expanded to the Z model, or the Z model as our American listeners would know it. And that was for the European market that wanted a really open mouthpiece. And when we called it the Z model, it was because Hawkins said, I am never making a mouthpiece more open than this. This is the end of the road. It's the end of the line. It's the end of the alphabet. And that's how the Z came to be.
Aren't you glad you guys went with letters instead of numbers for that model? There's no...
We would have run out of space to engrave it on the table.
I love that. Such a great story. It's always funny to think about, the stuff that happens kind of behind the scenes, because, people who are buying products don't always realize that sort of thing. Why was something called the way it was, or why is it marketed this way, or why does the picture look how it does, and all this kind of behind the scenes sort of stuff,
Well, that's something that I would ask you. I mean, when you joined Backun, one of the questions I had teed up for this discussion was, do the listeners know what you do on a day-to-day basis? I mean, have you ever talked about that? Have you ever talked about how you came to Backun and the stuff you now see behind the scenes that maybe not took for granted when you were a student, but I know you were a fan of Backun before you came to work with us. What has it been like for you coming to work for a company in the music industry?
It's actually been really interesting. And it's funny because my first experience with the Backun clarinet was only a few months before I got the job here, because I remember I picked up a used Protege that was basically in brand new condition. And it was a Coca-Cola one with the gold keys. So I always thought that looked super cool. And you know what? I like cool, flashy things like that. And I was teaching a lot of clinics at the time too. So kids love that too. They loved the fact that I had, is that real gold? I mean, wow, what kind of wood is that? They loved it, right? It inspires them to want to play. And I guess the thing about Backun I always liked is the same thing I've always kind of liked about Apple, is that they seem to be sort of changing things in the industry and shaking things up a bit and doing things a little different. And I don't know, I like that vibe. So I got this clarinet and my mind was kind of open to, wait a second, this is a intermediate clarinet that plays pretty good. And I started looking more into the brand and things like that. And we had chatted on the podcast, and I guess I wasn't really sure what to expect from the job, but there's been so much interesting stuff behind the scenes sort of being a part of. Like for me, a real highlight has been being part of the photo shoots and planning the website. And I don't know if people know, but all the pictures and stuff, like I'm on the other end of that clarinet holding it in the air for the photographer and my arm is sore, just as a note.
After a $34 manicure. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny.
The manicure that we paid for.
Well, it's funny things like that too people don't consider. Like, I had a manicure for the photo shoot, and those are my hands on the website too. It was funny because I never thought that part of my job at Backun would be getting a manicure for pictures to be taken. But if you think about it, behind the scenes, it makes sense your hands need to be, trim and looking good or whatever for that kind of thing. But the average person doesn't have that thought. So a lot of the planning and things are really quite interesting.
It's a really good point, and something that I think about often. The story of how I hired you or how you came to work for Backun is really one that I think is so applicable to everybody's life. Is that you never know where an opportunity is going to come. You never know where what you have done in the past, what relationships you have or have struck, or words that you have said will come back to help or potentially hurt you. In your case, you had interviewed somebody, and I was calling you, having known you and been on the podcast. I actually called you for a reference. And when I told you what this job was, you're like, wait, I'd like that job. And before we were off the phone, I had your resume in my hand. We hired you within 2 days. I remember that. It was super fast. Our HR person got in touch with you. She interviewed you. I had a call with you, and we were locked and loaded. And you started a few weeks later. And you've been with us ever since. And, it's been a pleasure to work with you. I have learned so much working with you. I mean, you are so multi-talented, and that's something that I don't think that the listeners know about you or I can appreciate it. And I don't want to be rude in that comment, but the amount of work that goes into creating a podcast, editing it, getting it out there, promoting it, it's huge. It's massive, and you are so dedicated to it. And along those lines, you've done the same work for Backun. I mean, if you've been to the Backun website, if you're a listener and you've been to the Backun website, you see Sean's handiwork. You see all of the effort that he puts into it. And what you are seeing is the website that we want you to see. You're actually not seeing all of the other websites that Sean is doing for Backun, such as Laskey, or our European website, or our Canadian website, or the global website, or our soon-to-be Australian website. These are all things that are geo-tagged and cached that you view based on your ISP. And I think, Sean, you just do an awesome job of managing that, managing the email marketing and everything that goes with it, because you're so passionate about it and you have a great eye for attention to detail. And you mentioned Apple, and we always talk about that when you and I have our design meetings and our weekly calls as well. What would Apple do? What would Steve Jobs do? And you are that voice of reason. It's like, well, if Apple's not doing it, then we're not doing it. And I'm like, yeah, you made your point.
No, thanks. I really appreciate that. And you raised an interesting point that those listeners should take into account too, is that I remember when I was a student, I was working in a Mac computer lab, and that was my job. I'd go to rehearsals and I'd go work in this computer lab for a few hours and help with tech support and remote system monitoring and installing software on workstations, about 50 of them and that kind of thing. But I remember back in the day, I told someone that was kind of my summer job or my part-time job in music. And they were like, oh, what are you doing? That's such a waste of time. You should be out at the BAMP Center, getting your chops up and blah, 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 blah. And in a way, they weren't wrong, because if you want to become a sole performer, that is kind of what you should be doing. But for me, I mean, all the other stuff that I did, extracurricular work kind of things, always fed back into what I was then able to do later. So like, if I didn't have that tech experience and experience with websites and working, with those kind of things, I'm not sure I would have been a good fit for this job, So whenever you're in that kind of situation, especially as a student, like take the jobs you have, and instead of being disappointed that you're not where you want to be, think about where those jobs might help you in the future. There's a lot of players too who never thought they'd be working on YouTube full time in 2020. And, any tech experience you had will really help you out nowadays,
Well, not only that, I mean, look at the pandemic. I mean, I don't want to cause alarm, but there's all these little cottage industries and people who are just like popping up with things that they've learned how to do at home, or for example, orchestra players who have pivoted to different working opportunities, or people that have decided to start up their own podcasts or their own YouTube channels during COVID. And I just want to call out again, and this is not to stroke your ego, but this is just a fact, is that, you were the originator in this. And you have, by far the most episodes, but also just the most diverse content. And that's what I really loved about sponsoring the Clarinet podcast, but being on it as well and listening to it. I mean, as you know, I'll listen to episodes, even if it's not a Backun artist, I'm still interested to listen. And in working with you to take on the role of guest host, I wanted to offer something different in terms of what I see as a need in the clarinet market. One that is focused on, let's call it outliers, topics that are totally different, things that we would never consider to be a topic just because it's so outside the realm of clarinet playing. But I find them fascinating, and I hope other people do too. So I want to take a second and let the listeners know a little bit about you outside of Clarinet and outside of Backun. What people might not know is that you are a huge car fanatic. And we often talk about it because my son, who is 9 years old, is a huge lover of cars as well. And so you're always sending me pictures to share with Noah, and he loves seeing them, loves seeing your cars. But you buy and sell and trade and scrounge for cars more than any human being I have ever seen, aside from Jay Leno, perhaps. So I'm curious to know, how did this love of cars come about? I mean, is it a lifelong thing? Is it recent? And what are you currently driving? Because that changes all the time.
Changing tomorrow. So I've been interested in cars, specifically like Camaros, since I was really young. I'll never forget the day we were driving downtown Calgary here, and we were under this specific overpass. I always remember it because we pulled under this overpass and I saw this car. I was in the back seat of our van. I'm like, oh my God, what is that? My dad said it's a Camaro. And I was like, man, that's the coolest looking car I've ever seen. It was a 1994 or 6 maybe, dark red, kind of maroon color. It's super cool, like just the way the swishes and the shapes. I'd never seen a sleeker car, and I since that day was like obsessed, like drawing them, painting them, like buying books and reading about them, and always thought I would never own one though, because I just never thought I would really do that. Fast forward a few years, I just had like run of the mill Mazda 3 cars or whatever just to get around, right? But we needed a second car, and I was like just looking around a lot, and I found this one that must have been priced wrong. Like it was a really great price. And long story short, there was some altercation I had with the sales manager. He was really rude to me, and they ended up just saying like, look, we feel bad. What do we got to do to get your business? I just named them some crazy low price and let me take the car. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, if I can get my dream car basically for less than a Honda Civic, like I'd rather drive that. So I didn't plan on selling that car right away. I drove it for about a year and a half. It was a white 2018 Camaro, really gorgeous. I love the white. I always like the white. After that, though, the pandemic hit, and things were a little uncertain. I didn't really need two cars. I mean, so I was like, you know what, I might as well sell it because the market's up. So I actually sold that car and made money on it, which was bizarre. That doesn't normally happen to people. But then I was looking around, and I've just noticed a couple ads for ones that I'd wanted in high school that were like a 2001 kind of model. And I didn't really want a car that old because, the maintenance, and it's not really that safe and all these kind of things. But I found a really good deal on one that I couldn't pass up. It was basically brand new. I mean, when I got in it, I felt like I was at a showroom. It was a really kind of life moment to just even sit in it and own it and just even see it. I would have been happy. But I bought it, and for a really good price, and took it home, and it only had like 50,000 kilometers in 20 years. Amazing car. But I loved that car. But as I drove it over the summer, I was kind of like, I've got a kid. She does like it in the back, but I'm worried about safety. I can't drive this in the winter. It's too kind of special and rare. It deserves a different kind of home right now. And so I was like, you know what? I had my fun with it. Let's see if I can get what I paid. And so some guy offered me 50% more than I paid for it. So I sold it only after about 5 months. But you know what? I look at it, I got paid for 5 months to drive my dream car, and hopefully I'll own one of those again. So then I've just been kind of looking since then. And I found just this week, actually, another kind of good deal on one that I like up in Edmonton. I'm going to go pick it up tomorrow. But it's another Camaro, but it's basically the same as my last one, except it's a manual with a track performance package on it. So I'm excited about it. But I've always liked the Camaros. I can't really explain the obsession, but people are like, well, why don't you get a Corvette? Why don't you get a Porsche? Why don't you get whatever? And I don't know, I'm just into the Camaros.
So aside from cars, the listeners might also not know that you have another podcast that you do. You are, outside of classical music, a massive Radiohead fan. I would say a groupie would probably be the more appropriate word, although you're not really flying around and like hanging out backstage like everybody else, or trying to get backstage at least, although I'm sure you have. But tell us about Radiohead. How did that happen? I mean, was it just love at first listen?
No, and that's what's funny about Radiohead for me is that at the time I was actually a really big fan. This was in high school again, but I was a really big fan of I was in band. I was a band nerd, I guess, listening to a lot of like orchestral band type of music. And if I listened to pop music, it wasn't very much. And it was usually like movie soundtracks and things like that. I don't know. That's kind of weird listening habits for a 17, 18-year-old, but sure. But anyways, I was becoming a fan of this band called Matthew Good Band, which in Canada is kind of like a national. He never really got famous outside of here, but he's had his issues over the years. But really interesting kind of music and songwriting, and really great lyrics, and great singer. I always found it really compelling, and I felt like I discovered like this really sort of special music that, as a Canadian, was like kind of unique to us, and I was sort of like protective of it. So I was at the record store one day, and I'd consumed all of his records. People listening might not know this, but you used to go into a store and buy music. How crazy is that? And if they don't have it, you can't listen to
it. Totally.
How weird is that, right? Anyway, but I went into the store, and I was like, well, I guess I've consumed all his records. I mean, he only had about 4 or 5 albums out at that point, maybe. And I went up to the guy at the counter, which also you do before Spotify playlists. You just trust the shaggy-haired guy at the counter. And I said, hey, like, what else might I like? I like this guy and not really into pop music other than that. He said, well, you might like Radiohead, but we only got this one. And he passed me this disc, and it was OK Computer, which, if you're listening, is kind of alt rock, kind of late art rocky somewhat album. Anyway, I went home and listened to it, and I actually really didn't like it. I was like, oh man, this guy sounds like a chicken. This is kind of tacky. Oh, I'm so much happier that Matthew Good still is better than this. Good for me. But as I often did, because back in the day, if it was nowadays, I never would have listened to it again. But back in the day, if you invested $20, $25 in a CD, you owed it to yourself to listen to it, because otherwise you're going to trade it in for $10 at a loss. And that was kind of stupid, you know? So I owed myself a few more listens. And about the third or fourth listen through, suddenly it just struck me. And I was like, wait a minute, there's some really interesting rhythms. These harmonies are kind of really also neat too. And one of the things I love about Radiohead that persists through most of their music is that it's a grower. Like, you don't necessarily like it the first time. You have to listen to it 5, 10, 100 times. And every time you do that, a new sort of layer unfurls. And it's really weird, because I don't know how you can listen to something 100 times and still hear something new. And that's, to me, that's bizarre. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, it's kind of depressing, and it doesn't really have a tune. It's not catchy. And I guess they're not wrong. But to me, there's just something really interesting about the song structure and the levels of layers in the music. And yeah, just really interesting to me.
I don't think that's unusual. I mean, especially in classical music.
Yeah.
Our listeners probably don't know that I have a master's degree in opera. And while not a formal clarinetist, I've been known to pick one up from time to time. Mary Backun was my clarinet teacher when I was in elementary school. But she'll probably deny it if anybody asks. And then I pivoted to brass instruments. But I got into singing in my late teens and really focused on opera through college and then into graduate school and performances thereafter. But when you listen to an opera, I've seen Tristan und Isolde at least a dozen times. I've seen it at the Met, San Francisco. I've seen it Seattle. And every time I see it, I hear something different. I appreciate something different. And it's no different than, a Beethoven symphony. I'm a huge fan of Beethoven and Bach. And I can listen to those pieces over and over and over again, and I just find something different to appreciate each time. And that always brings me back. This morning, I was listening to Janacek, and I'm like, what the heck is this piece? This is insane. And I knew this piece, but I didn't know it. And that's something that obviously you found with Radiohead that just keeps you coming back for more all the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because it's one of the problems with classical music being branded to the society is that they say, if you want to relax, put on relaxing classical music. It's never relaxing if you're really listening properly, or you're listening to something that's actually of any interest. I mean, it might be nice to put on Adagio for strings and cook dinner if you're in a very romantic mood or something, but there's a lot of classical music that's very tumultuous and many, many layers. I mean, Mahler, Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, all the operas and things. Like, we're talking music that's very heavy, and you can't just put that on while you do your studying, But then pop music gets kind of the same bad rap, as people are like, well, I want to listen to it at the gym. Well, sorry, but you can't listen to Motion Picture Soundtrack at the gym. It's a song by Radiohead. But Radiohead's interesting because their guitarist actually has he's not classically like educated in a university, but he is classically trained, and as a side job, he actually writes movie soundtracks and symphonic pieces, and has his own classical record label, which is something a lot of people don't realize. But strangely enough, Radiohead, even though they have all this kind of classical like layers and influences and things like that, one of the things that boggles me, and I'm going to ask the band about it if I ever can chat with them about it, but they never go past a normal song length. Only once have they done a 7-minute song, and even that had 3 kind of parts that were almost unique songs. But they're not doing like what a band like Yes would do with like a 20-minute, 25-minute meander. They've kind of found this Goldilocks point where they don't push the boundary too far, and it's just enough to make it interesting and compelling for people, which is also an art,
So, aside from cars and clarinets and Radiohead, let's chat about your family for a minute. I know you don't often share a lot of personal things, but I think it's really important for the listeners, and those especially who support Clarinet through Patreon and support and what you do financially, because it costs money to create these podcasts. I know you pay somebody to edit them, as well as you doing some of the editing work yourself and all of the hosting and everything that goes with it. Tell us about parenting. Over the past couple of years, you and your wife have welcomed now 2 children to the family. What has that been like for you?
It's been, at first it was going to be, I was scared it was going to be like totally overwhelming. And it was, and it is for a while. But you just change and kind of adapt. I mean, I think a lot of people are really afraid to have kids these days because they're afraid that they're not financially ready, or they're not having the time, or this or that or whatever. And I think that in the past, people didn't really have that choice. Like, there wasn't as many options to start a family later, right? So everyone started a family earlier. And so in a way, we were joking about this the other day. Like, I wish we had kids and we were in our 20s, because like I was up all night at that point anyways, doing, partying or whatever. And now I'm 35, I want to sleep, but I can't. So the energy levels are kind of different. So if you're younger and you're thinking you someday want to have kids, I mean, start yesterday, because you need the energy. That's for sure. But I think it's true, there's never really a good time. So you just got to, it's one of those things, you're going to figure it out on the way. And everybody does, you have to, right? That's just kind of what life is. But it's been really amazing in a lot of ways. I mean, it's kind of weird because my daughter, both of them now, actually, you think they were twins. They look the same. It's really weird, but they also both look a lot like me.
I would hope that they look the same. They have the same parents. At least
Yeah,
I think they do,
yeah.
but yeah.
Like identical. Like, we keep mixing them up, and it's kind of weird. Yeah, I mean, they look like me, so it's kind of weird because you see yourself in them a little bit. And I guess what no one really prepares you for kind of is like the moments of parenting that are like really valuable. They're not things that you'd expect, like, things like the first word you think would be the most memorable, but it's really more like the way things make you feel at times. And I think that's been kind of the most interesting. Like, when we gave her a guitar for her 3rd birthday, which is a kind of a big gift for a 3-year-old. It's on the wall over there. I don't expect her to use it for a while, but it's just like a cheap, whatever. But like, just the way she was so excited about that was amazing.
I agree. I mean, being a parent of 3 kids, so at the time of recording, our kids are 11, 9, and 7. And this year, all 3 of them are on ice sports. And as I mentioned earlier, with not having to travel with COVID, I'm now helping with the teams. I'm the assistant coach for my son's hockey team. I used to play hockey. Started when I was 4 years old, so a good old Canadian boy, born with skates on my feet. So coaching his team, and then one of my daughters, the 7-year-old, plays in the female hockey team. She plays for the Ravens, and she's just a monster. We call her Mega Beast because she's a monster on the ice. And then my 11-year-old plays ringette, which some of our listeners might say, what the heck is ringette? It is a sport that was originally founded in the 60s because girls couldn't play hockey. So they came up with this sport that's basically like hockey, but instead of a blade on the end of a stick, it's just a straight stick and then a ring. And girls and females and women played that, and some boys too. And now it's very gender fluid. People, of all ages and genders play it. And it's been amazing this year. My son, he transitioned from playing ringette for 2 years into hockey for the first time. He really wanted to be with his friends and play hockey. And I was on the bench for his first goal right at the beginning of the season, and it was electric. I was like, get me that puck. I want that puck. I'm gonna frame that puck. And just to see the sheer elation on his face, watching it, I mean, he one-timed it. He's been practicing his slap shots, and he one-timed it so hard. I thought it was going to go through the net for a 9-year-old. But anyway, I digress. I actually haven't, being me, I just haven't had time to frame it. As you know, and our listeners will probably know, I carry a lot of, or wear a lot of different hats at Backun. So, there's no such thing as the average 40-hour work week for me. It's more like 80, or, especially when I get your phone calls and texts, it's like 120.
In the morning.
So I haven't had time yet, but I'm going to get there. It's sitting on my nightstand, this giant puck that's got Bauer written on it. But I want to take you into a different topic. I want to take you into clarinet playing. and where you see the clarinet world going. You have a very unique insight because of your experience interviewing so many people in such a diverse background. What are your thoughts on the clarinet world? And I don't want to get political. I don't want to get specific, but I know you have your own thoughts, and I'm curious. Like, what do you see that is happening through COVID, and now that potentially we're coming out of it in the future?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that the writing has sort of been on the walls for quite a long time. I mean, arguably maybe 50, 100 years, that orchestras are not going to be a sustainable way forward for most musicians, and especially the fact that, back in the 50s and before that too, there was a lot of people who were employed by studios recording records, and basically their day job was to come in and, sight read gigs. And there wasn't just more symphony orchestras, but there was more like all kinds of different bands you could play in, orchestras and things like that, and actually make money or a living recording, playing. The wind repertoire is much bigger than most people realize, as far as like studio and commercial music and musicals and opera and orchestra. It can be so multifaceted, but nowadays we're in kind of a very unique situation where the only people who get those kind of jobs, especially the big jobs, are it's like winning a seat, not a seat, but a seat. What would you call it? A hockey team, a position on a hockey team, NHL. I mean, how many people play hockey? How many people are really going to get in the NHL? It's an extraordinarily small number. I feel like that's what orchestras have unfortunately become for anyone who's not recreational. That becomes a problem because I don't want to say pigeonholing, but that's kind of what it is. You're focused. So to get there, you have to focus so intently on what you want to the exclusion of all else. And if you don't get there, a lot of musicians face incredible disappointment and confusion because maybe they've spent 5 years flying around auditioning and hoping to play with the 2 or 3 degrees they have in an orchestra, and now they're kind of stuck. So I don't really know what that means for orchestras, but I think that what that means for clarinet players is that if you're not sure 100% in your heart that you want to play in an orchestra, you have to consider that you're not going to, because you won't play in an orchestra if you're not 100% dedicated full time, especially a good one. It's not possible, because for every person like you who's not 100% there are 10 who are 100% there, and even they might not get the job. you know so for me, what I had to look at is I was really lucky because when I came out of university, the reason I didn't go get a master's right away is because I was subbing almost every week with our local professional orchestra, to the point where it was like, I don't know, I was going there like almost every week, several times. And it felt like my job really for a little while. And that was due to a couple of things, like the one person hurt themselves, one had surgery, and there was a shortness of subs that year. So it was a kind of a perfect storm that I lucked out. But I got to play a lot for 2 or 3 years. And you'd think that that would have really inspired me to go further, but I was kind of starting to see that it wasn't for me. And I think that for a lot of clarinet players, there's a certain sense of shame in that. It's like, wait a minute, I got my degree in this. I thought that'd be my job someday, and I have to like it, right? And I didn't really. I mean, it was kind of boring. You get there, it's the same music every year. I mean, how many times, if you play in an orchestra for 40 years, are you going to play the Nutcracker? You got to be that kind of person. They don't really prepare you for that element. So I was very fortunate and happy with the fact that I had also been interested in contemporary music and teaching and doing clinics. And, at some point I eventually came up with the podcast idea. Like, I'm willing to do other things. And if you're not willing to kind of open up and expose yourself to opportunities that might arise that are actually of interest to you, you might not find them. And then you're going to face a lot of disappointment potentially if you don't get that orchestral job, which, like I said, if you're not 100% sure, you really should start thinking of your options and what else your life could look like. There's a lot of people who don't play in orchestras who are really happy. I know a lot of them as Backun artists. They do a lot of really cool stuff, perfectly happy, successful people in their own right, and that you need to be open to the fact that that might be you.
Morgan Nielsen comes to mind. Every time I think of her,
she's a Balkan bump or something.
Yeah, she has this Balkan band, which she teaches. She lives in the San Fran, the Bay Area, but she teaches. She travels all over the place. She does a lot of weddings, a lot of events. She's living outside of the box in terms of classical clarinet playing, although that's what she was trained in. And it's amazing. Every time I see a picture of her, she's got a smile on her face. Every time I hear from her, it's something positive. And from my own studies, just to be transparent and vulnerable for a second, I had a real moment in my life when I was going through grad school where my voice teacher had said to me, he's like, I want you to go do your DMA, your doctorate after. And I said, but I don't want to. That's not what I want to do. I want to be a performer. And he's like, well, you got to think about that. And I went home to my grad studies apartment. I lived in Salt Lake City at the time. And I really thought about it. And I was like, what is it going to be like when, I'm X years old and taking temp jobs and trying to pay the bills and still doing auditions. And I don't want to couch surf, and I don't want to be like that. And I made that hard choice to say, you know what, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to go back to Backun. Maury had just started the business. He was about 2 years in. And I was still flying back and forth between Salt Lake City and Vancouver to make barrels by hand before we had CNC machines, and to help him with the business and to travel. I was still doing that pretty much full time while I was doing my master's degree in the States. And I said, you know what? That's not for me. I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to choose to be comfortable in life, to know what I want to do in terms of working for the business, and to put my creative skills and my passions to that rather than auditioning and doing everything else and hoping that I make it. And this was back in the day when, in the very early days of Backun, where people were like, "Oh, you guys are a fad. You're not going to be here in 5 years. Good luck." Nobody wants to buy a barrel for $200. And I kind of look at that now. And actually, when I was interviewing Jessica Phillips last week for one of my podcast guest hosted episodes, she had said, "What is it like?" And I said, I don't regret it. It was really hard to make that change, but something great came out of that, and that's Backun. I mean, I've been here pretty much since day one. I took some time off for an MBA, and it's just seeing the company in 21 years and seeing where we've grown and seeing where the clarinet world has grown and has changed. And you're right. There is a threat to classical music, and hopefully there will always be classical music, but orchestras are changing, careers are changing. People are looking at academia now as legit options for careers, or military, where in the past it was like, well, I guess I'll go do that. But now it's like, no. I mean, during COVID, there are many educators who had medical and dental and full paychecks during that time, and they were still teaching, and other people weren't. And it was really hard to see. It really was. And so many people persevered, and they're coming out of it, and it's just been fabulous to see and fabulous to experience. So, and I say fabulous to experiences and to see the human spirit, not to see other people suffer, but to see the positiveness that is from, people rallying together.
If I could add one more thing to this kind of concept, a lot of people listening are probably going, well, that's not me. I'm going to stick with it and do this. And you might. Good for you. But one other thing you have to calculate or account for is the potential that you may not be able to, even if you want to. And for that could be a multitude of things. I mean, maybe you have an injury like I had in 2016. That it was ironic because I'd always thought I would practice and audition for the actual chair in the symphony in my city. But the year the audition came up was the year that I destroyed my right hand. And so even if I wanted to, it doesn't matter how bad I would have wanted to, I couldn't play. For 6 months, I couldn't play. And even now, it's not the same, It never really came back fully. And that was one of the things that led me into the podcasting more seriously and eventually pursuing the job at Backun and doing other things. But also, having a family, that is something you want to be here for. You don't want to be at the concert hall every weekend. Or maybe you don't want to be. And that could be another thing that, throws a wrench into those plans. So it's not that ever, every time we have these kind of conversations on here, I never want to say that there's anything wrong with those type of performing careers. All I'm saying is that you should make backup plans. And there's people who say, if you make a backup plan, it's planning to fail. That's really not very good advice because you just got to be open to the idea that things might not go your way. And if they don't, what else can you do? What else are you interested in? How can you use your interesting musical experiences to help some other path, for example, But if you do get to exactly where you want, perfect. this is kind of an odd example of something but I think that people should do this in their careers. I don't know if you ever back to kids for a second. Did you ever go to like a pregnancy or birthing coaching class with your wife?
Yeah, we went to a few of those at the very just for the first kid, and then we were like, we're done here.
Yeah, no, I don't need that. But one thing they did interesting, which I think that people should do as a career or about their career choice, is what they sort of said is like, okay, they had the woman plan exactly how her perfect birth would go. Like, okay, I'd get to the hospital and I would do this, and then I would do this, and blah. They would lay it out. And they had the person come around and say, okay, so that's how you'd want it to go, right? And they say, yes. And they would take one of the things away. They'd say, what would you do if this happened? You know, maybe instead of giving a normal birth, you had to have a C-section. When their face would go, but I don't want that. And they would say, well, you may not get that choice. What are you going to do now? How will your day look different? And they kept taking cards away until the cards were completely different. And they made everyone realize that, like, wait, this could go anyway. It doesn't matter how you want it to go. And I think that it would have been helpful as a career to be like, okay, you want to be an international touring superstar who does this, 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 and this, records albums and travels. And what if you can't do this? And look at the pandemic. It took everything away from everybody.
It's so funny when you mention about delivering and having kids, because we had that idea of this is what it's going to be like. And our first two kids, 2 years apart, they were like nothing normal. I'm not going to get into details. And then Jen, my wife, for the third, she's like, can I please just have a normal delivery? And the third one was like textbook. And it was just, she was like, thank you. And we're done.
I wish. Yeah, exactly. I know, but there's a good lesson though with all that though, is that, like, you know, things don't go how you want always. And if you can think and plan, you'll have a leg up on it, right?
And schools are changing. You know, when I was doing my undergraduate degrees, I have several master's degrees. When I was doing my degrees, they weren't focusing on the things outside of the school, outside of the classroom, out off the concert stage. They weren't talking about how to save, how to manage your finances, how to promote yourself, how to do recordings, all of those things that are just so important today. And you have to be a well-rounded musician. And I often think about that. And look, there are so many amazing gifts that come out of being a classically trained musician or a classically trained performer, and then not going that route. Ron Odrich, who's a Backun artist, is one of the most respected periodontists in the world. He was Bernstein's periodontist. And he was really close with Bob Marcellus. Really, really, really close. Personally studied with him, the whole thing, groomed by him. And Ron decided to go to medical school and become a periodontist, and a world famous one at that. He was also a writer, etc. I mean, a published writer of books. And he's had an amazing career, and yet still has that close, tight connection to classical music. So I'm always fascinated by those relationships.
Yeah. I mean, if you can enrich your life in different ways, then, get more of the things that for you mean something. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is by Glenn Gould. He said, in a perfect world, there'd be no need for art because the artists would be living their life and their life would be art, something like that. I always thought that was really cool. And I kind of take that into account. And I think about that every time I do something, like even planning my office, like this is my home. This is my work of art thing. I do it how I want to do it. You don't get control over much in life. So whenever you're doing things, you should think that way.
Well, and you change up your office quite often. I mean, you change up your office about as much as you change your cars.
I've finalized it now. I think anyways.
All right, should we roll to a closing and then we'll launch into these lightning round questions?
Thank you so much for listening to the Clarineat podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to check out our back catalog wherever you get your podcasts. There's over 160 conversations now with world-class clarinetists, and I think that there's definitely something for everyone. If you do want access to extended ad-free content, I invite you to join our community at clarineat.com/join. You can get a free trial for 30 days with code TRYGOLD, that's TRYGOLD, at checkout, and the gold edition is what I call the ad-free extended version of the podcast. However, for Joel's hosted or guest hosted content here, he has generously offered to sponsor the lightning round for everybody to preview. So today you're going to get a chance to enjoy that free of charge, so please do enjoy it. But if you want access to more content like this, please do consider helping to support the podcast. It really goes a long way to helping me bring this content to you, and I want to thank our over 60 backers that we currently have in Patreon and the several more on the website who have just started signing up. So thank you so much for doing that. At this point in the show, I normally like to allow some listener sort of content to roll in. Some people have been listening and reminded themselves that they would like to come back on as guests after a time. So I'm really excited to bring back some conversations with some people you might find familiar in the coming weeks, and some new conversations as well. One listener wrote in and asked if I could invite a very famous artist on the show, who I won't announce yet because I haven't quite confirmed the interview date, but I'm pleased to say that spurred me to reach out to this person, and I'm now in the process of booking an interview. So don't think that your requests are not valuable to me. I do take them seriously, and if I like the idea you bring to the table, I will try to pursue that as an episode idea. So thank you so much again to everyone for supporting the show, and I do hope that you enjoy the upcoming episodes. We're going to take a bit of a break from Joel's hosted content here. I've got a couple episodes that I've had in the can for a few months that I'm really excited to get out over the next couple weeks, and then we'll dive back into some conversations that Joel will be hosting after that. So thank you so much again for listening. I look forward to seeing you next time on the Clarineat podcast. But don't go anywhere, because there's a little bit of lightning round questions left with me right after these messages from our sponsors. Imagine a reed that lets you focus on your music, lasts for months instead of days, and even saves you money in the long run. It's all possible with Leger Reeds, the world's leading synthetic reed brand made right here in Canada. The European cut reed is preferred by Leger artists all over the world, including Eddie Daniels, David Schifrin, Corrado Giuffretti, and many others. It offers a warm, clean sound with a great ease of articulation and is now available for E-flat, B-flat, and the bass clarinet. Learn more at your local music store or at leger.com. That's LEGERE.com. The new Backun Q-Series clarinet features a completely redesigned bore inspired by the Backun Custom Series clarinets. This means you can play and perform like the pros, but for less. Use code Clarineat at backunmusical.com to save 10% on your entire purchase, and try the Backun Q-Series or Protégé clarinet risk-free for 30 days. Just pay the return shipping if you aren't fully satisfied. Shop now at backunmusical.com and use code Clarineat at checkout.
All right, Sean. So the lightning round. I ask, you answer. If you could have dinner with anyone, living or deceased, who would it be?
That's a good question. I want to say Tom York, because I'd love to just get him on my other podcast. He's the lead singer of Radiohead, but I have met him. And I'm not sure actually we'd have that much in common. So I actually would like to probably go with Glenn Gould.
Oh, wow. That would be epic.
Yeah.
What's your non-classical desert island recording?
Radiohead Kid A.
All right. That was pretty fast. That was zero hesitation. Everyone has a guilty pleasure. What's yours?
Nacho chips and like Doritos. Since I was young, there's just
with dip or without.
The chef here, who's me, makes amazing Dorito like baked with everything on it and stuff. And I don't really need the dip because I use so much cheese. The cheese is kind of the dip. But if I do dip, I'll sometimes actually even make like a little kind of bruschetta or something that goes with it with homemade guacamole. But if I'm in a hurry, sour cream will do, some basic salsa. But yeah, I don't know why. Just something's wrong with me and just chips. I love chips.
There's nothing wrong with that. All right. What has parenting taught you?
I think honestly, it's just taught me that life is about more than yourself. And I know that's very cliche, but it feels different now that there's a legacy beyond the stuff that I'm doing. It's kind of expanded that a little bit. And I don't know, you just think differently about the world and your choices and what things might affect other people and being more, accepting. And I don't know. I think that's what it would kind of mean to me, is like just kind of the legacy is different now and feels different. And I think we'll never go back. It stays that way now, right?
True. All right. What's one thing you've taken for granted?
Taken for granted would definitely be like physical well-being, because after I hurt myself with that hand injury, it just really woke me up to like, it's a small disability really, because like I could still walk and whatever, but like I couldn't type, I couldn't open a jar, I couldn't play clarinet, I couldn't do anything for 6 months. I've never told anyone on the podcast this before, but I literally couldn't move my fingers for months. And my injury was so bad and I had such bad health treatment that the tendons had fused to the bone. So I had extensive physiotherapy and stuff to move the tendons. And I should have had more surgery, but I elected not to. But the first time I actually played clarinet again after that, I cried.
Really?
It was just, yeah, it was so emotional. I didn't know it meant so much to me. And it was like, I hadn't done it in 6 months. And it just was like, whoa, it just hit me like that. It was weird. My wife was there at the time too. And she was like, oh, that was interesting. I wasn't expecting that. And I was like, neither was I. I don't know. But it makes me think of something Laurie Friedman once told me back in 2015, when I first started the podcast. We were out for a drink somewhere in Calgary because she was in town. She mentioned something about like her story is that she ended up kind of going into what she did because she had a lip injury where a dog bit her face and she couldn't form normal embouchure anymore. And so that's why she plays so much like contrabass clarinet in such an interesting way and whatever. But I'd said at that meeting, for some reasons, we were talking about like, what if you couldn't play anymore? And I was like, I'm not sure it would really bother me or whatever. And she's like, don't say that until it's taken away. And
Wow.
I was like, okay, noted. And a couple years later, there I was, and I was like, man, it just was emotional, just shed a tear for coming it back,
I remember when that happened. Yeah.
Yeah, it was bad.
Yeah.
Really bad. So yeah, you don't take your health for granted or your physical well-being, because like not everyone gets to have two arms. It makes you realize how lucky you are when things are working.
Totally.
So
What's the best advice you've never been given?
I would say financial advice. I have a friend who is a multimillionaire now, and he's where I get a lot of my investing and car flipping ideas and stuff from, because he's like, look, if you're not willing to risk things, you won't make things, right? And he's the kind of guy who buys 3, 4, or 5 cars a year too. And in the past year, he's owned a Porsche, a Ferrari, whatever. He's picking a new Lamborghini Huracan this week or something like that. He's loaded, right? But he's also in medicine, and he's doing really well. But he makes very good investment decisions, very good car, decisions, things like that. Like he's always making money. But I lived with him. He was my roommate for a couple of years. And even back then, we were just doing our thing. And he was always like leaving the house to go off to his job, which was working at a casino. And he was so smart. He always saw money as just numbers. And so if you look at money that way, it kind of changes the game of money. It's like, well, it's really just collecting numbers. And I wish that had kind of stuck with me more earlier. And I'd had, if I'd bought Apple stock instead of my first Apple computer, it would have been crazy, but he thinks like that. He'll make that thought like, oh, I could do this instead of that. And it turns into that. And he's really thinking down the road and investing and all this stuff. And musicians don't think enough about that stuff. And they should, because you can play the game too. It's just numbers.
Truth. What's your go-to scale or study?
Everybody's scale has got to be that big long F major, right? When you just go all the way up and test that things are working. And I usually bust out a couple of chromatic things after that, like everybody else.
I asked Eddie Daniels that same question, and he was like, open G, Joel. Open G is all you need. And he just did it right in front of me, and I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, Eddie, you made your point. He's like, really? What else is there? Just open G.
He likes that. I don't know. It's true, actually, though. Some of the noodling gets a bit much. Like you go to Clarinet Fest, and you can tell who's actually serious by how few notes they're playing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Play a couple of notes, they're listening, how it's responding, and then you got the people who are like 45 octave C scale.
Totally.
Not playing.
or like now that I'm in the brass world, just people blowing as hard as they can, like high C's, thinking they're Maynard Ferguson. I'm like, no, that's just A, you're not Maynard, and B, there's just no value in that, right? So, if the pandemic taught you anything, what is it?
I think it's that we're still living in history. I know that's a weird thing to say, but I've only had that thought a couple of times in life. And what I mean, I guess, is, when you're reading a history book and you're like, that's crazy, I can't believe that happened. And like, it just seems bizarre. There's so many years that pass in between big events that doesn't seem like reality anymore. But a big one for me was 9/11. When that happened, I was like, what? Like, that is crazy. And there's been a couple other smaller things that kind of hit like that, but this hits like that. This is something that you'll read about in history books and be like, what on earth? How did people even, like, what? So I think that that's the thing that made me realize is just like we're still living in history. Anything could happen. And we're also fortunate for the level of peace and security and prosperity that we have, because that could also be taken away or go away, or who knows,
Totally. What's on your nightstand?
My nightstand is my Kindle, my iPod, or not iPod. What's this called? iPhone charging stand. That's actually it. I'm very minimal. We have a very minimal kind of like bed thing with these like slotted nightstands, and yeah, just keep that there. I like to have the phone near me so I can check my work emails at 3 a.m. when the kids get up crying, screaming.
Last question. What is the most interesting interview you've had on Clarinet, or who is the most interesting interviewee? Current company not included.
Yeah. Joel Jaffe. That's a good question. It's sometimes hard to think because there's been so many of them now. Like I think we're at like 170 or 80 interviews or something over the years. So I'm probably gonna, forget one along the way. But and it does depend on the day too, really. I think in some ways Doreen Ketchens, because like I think she was incredibly passionate. I think more so than people even can understand. Like talking with her is like radiating energy. It's crazy.
Have you ever seen her perform live?
Not in person.
So Maury and I were in New Orleans. We've been several times for business, but we were there for the NASMD, National Association of School Music Dealers event. They have a yearly event where the owners and reps from school music dealers come to a specific place, and they learn, and they attend this conference, and then they party and go play golf or whatever. And Maury and I were there, and we walked several blocks down and saw Doreen. This is before we knew her. And we were mesmerized. And we stood there on the street corner for hours. I'm totally not kidding you. And we put in a lot of money into her bucket. She didn't know who we were. We didn't talk to her about clarinets. That wasn't the goal. It was just to appreciate her artistry. And it is electric, is really the only way to put it. I mean, she is one of the most soulful people that has ever picked up a musical instrument.
There's something about that kind of, you say soulful. I mean, I find that a lot of people like in America, one thing I like about Americans is they tend to be very much more passionate and honest about their passions. But that's especially true of like Southerners. I don't know, like people from that region, especially, like they like what they like, and they're going to cook you up with what's that big thing called with the crawdads in it or whatever.
The jambalaya or
jambalaya. Yeah, they're going to cook up a jambalaya and have a party, and you're invited, and everyone's so great, and I love life, and I don't know, I like that. I like that kind of vibe.
It is awesome. It is
very
awesome.
different than here, where we're all inside minus 40 and
Oh, Canada. That's
yeah,
for sure.
exactly right.
Sean, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today, for sharing your knowledge and your experience with our listeners. I hope that they enjoyed a glimpse outside of the normal Sean, host of the Clarinet podcast. Finally, thanks to all of you, our valued listeners, for subscribing to the Clarinet podcast and supporting Sean's work. As you've all heard, it's truly a labor of love. Signing off from Vancouver, Canada, I'm Joel Jaffe, guest host of the Clarinet podcast.